Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Thank you very much indeed for turning out on such a dreadful evening, and I think we've got a very good audience, an excellent panel, and some very interesting questions that the panel will answer. I'd like, first of all, if I may, to introduce our panel, starting with the lady on my right, Suzanne Evans, who is now the Deputy Chairman of UKIP. Suzanne was born in Shrewsbury in Shropshire and then went on to university at Lancaster, where she had a BA in Honours with Religious Studies, and she obviously feels very much at home here in this church this evening. Suzanne worked for the BBC for 12 years and in such important roles as reporter and presenter for BBC's various programmes, and has appeared on Question Time, Newsnight, Daily Politics and Radio 4 Today. Suzanne now works as a freelance PR and marketing consultant, and her clients speak very highly of her work. And in 2011, she founded the national health charity Lipoma UK. Suzanne was a Conservative councillor for Merton until she defected to the UKIP but lost her seat in 2014. Suzanne has been a key player in the development of UKIP and has written a book, The Essential Guide to UKIP. Nigel Farage said, "Her calibre is undeniable, and this should silence our critics that UKIP does not appeal to women." Suzanne is now standing as the UKIP candidate for her hometown in Shrewsbury in the next general election. She has a huge task to overturn a very large Conservative vote. Please warmly welcome Suzanne. Our next panelist is Robert Evans, and I would like to particularly thank Robert for attending this evening. We had on our panel originally Steve Reed, but has been called away to a security planning meeting as a result of the terrorist action in Paris last weekend. Robert was born in Ashford in Surrey, where he started his schooling before attending Shoreditch College. He went on to gain a master's degree at the Institute of Education in the University of London. He was elected MEP for the Labour Party in 1994 in North London and became a freelance journalist, consultant to several MPs and MEPs, and his special expertise is in Southern Asia, works with such charities as BRAC, who is the largest NGO, and is working in the world in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc. Robert has substantial experience of foreign aid, but took Eric Pickles to task over the government's lack to support the UK citizens in the severe floods in Somerset and the Thames Valley last year. Robert is a Surrey County councillor, a member of the Children's Education Committee, and he speaks French, Spanish, German, and is learning Bengali. Please welcome Robert. On my left, we have Maxwell-Scott, and Matthew was born in southwest London and followed the Prime Minister into Eton. Matthew has a master's degree in politics from Edinburgh, and this is an unusual one. Thank you. Thank you. And this is a very unusual one, and thank you very much indeed. I hope I won't get electrocuted in this. Thank you. I'm sorry about the electrics. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Sorry about the interruption. Matthew currently works as a speechwriter for Number 10, no doubt, a road safety campaigner for the leading insurance company, and has previously worked for 9 years for the CBI. He led a local campaign to have Boris re-elected as Mayor of London in 2012. Matthew is the Conservative candidate for Coleshill and Wallington and is well placed for tonight's debate as he knows Justin Greening, the Minister in charge in Foreign Aid, very well. Please welcome Matthew. Tom Brake, not Tom Drake, but Tom Brake is the Minister on the current coalition government and is standing in Lib Dem for Carshalton and Wallington. He was born in the pork pie country of Melton Mowbray, but lived in France from the age of 8 and attended the Lycée International School in Paris. Tom became a councillor in Hackney in 1988 and in Sutton in 1994, and in 1997 was elected as the MP for Carshalton and Wallington, causing a huge swing away from the Conservatives. Tom has won 4 elections in a row, but now has a fight on his hands against Matthew, our Conservative panellist. Tom is now a coalition minister and is deputy leader of the House of Commons and became a Privy Councillor in the Queen's Birthday Honours list in 2011. Tom has achieved many things as an MP, such as retaining the A&E at St Heliers Hospital in Sutton, and one of his claims to fame is that he runs the Christmas annual card competition in the area for primary schools. Please welcome Tom. Sasha is our Green panellist. Sasha Khan was born in Islington and has lived in London all his life. He has in fact lived just 10 minutes a walk from the venue tonight. And for more than 32 years, initially living in his Bangladesh parents and now with his wife and 2-year-old daughter. He is the only member of our panel who is running as parliamentary candidate in the Croydon North constituency. He is well known for taking the Sutton Council to the High Court for approving a health-damaging waste incinerator less than 3 miles from where we are now. He is the Green parliamentary candidate for Croydon North in the general election, which is just 2,691 hours away. Please welcome our panel for tonight. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I have enough questions here to last us until about 4 o'clock in the morning. So I will forgive you if you want to leave in about an hour, because that's when we'll be leaving. My first question, and I'm not sure whether the questioner is actually here or not, but the first question is, last year, the government poured more than 1 billion into 19 out of the top 20 countries run by the world's most corrupt regimes, such as Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and North Korea. Tory MP Philip Davis has said this is a colossal waste of money. Do the panel agree, and what should we do about it? Can I have the first response from Suzanne, please?
Thank you very much. I think most of us, when we give charity either through our own purses or when we give it through our taxes, through government aid, I don't think we expect it to be going to prop up corrupt regimes. That's not what we think of as being overseas development, quite the opposite. And yes, it's clearly wrong. And I think this is one of the problems that we've got with the arbitrary target that the government has now set of giving 0.7% of GDP in foreign aid. It's a very arbitrary target. I've heard that there are situations when the Department for International Development is literally shoveling money out of the door to meet the target rather than to meet any specific need. And it's wrong if it goes into a corrupt government's pockets. And unfortunately, particularly with bilateral aid, which is paid directly to governments, this is what happens. Just to give you one example, there was an investigation recently by the Institute of Economic Affairs, and they found that 70% of arms in Africa had actually been financed by government aid from some country or another. And I think this is one of the problems of the 0.7% target, and it's why UKIP would cut it.
Thank you, Suzanne. Robert?
Thank you. Well, I'd agree with Suzanne on one point, that we don't want money going to corrupt governments. Of course we don't want that. But in those countries, the countries which have been referred to, you've got some of the poorest people in the world, you've got some of the most disadvantaged children on the planet, and you've got some of the most needy areas. So we do wish to support those areas. There are also, many of them are countries with which we've got historical links. You could argue that we've also got historical responsibilities. So I think we should be giving money to the, I mean, some of the countries listed of which Britain has had involvement in one way or other could be Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, go through a number of the other ones, Iraq, Haiti, you know, and then there's Sudan, which is a desperate, South Sudan, which is one of the most desperate countries on the planet. And if you're saying we should stop all finance to there, you are really going to make the lives of some people in the world, which are really very, very desperate and very poor at the moment, you're going to make them even worse, and you'll find that children and families will suffer even more, and we won't be able to play any part in trying to control the Ebola crisis. So it would be making a desperate situation worse. What we should be doing instead, and you won't agree with this either, we should be cooperating with the other countries in Europe to make certain that we have a more coordinated plan, a more balanced approach, and we should also be working with the UN and some of the international NGOs in these different countries to make certain that the money is getting to the people to whom it's intended and not going to corrupt governments. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but an easy solution is not to withdraw from that, because that would make the situation much worse.
Thank you, Tom. I haven't read the piece in question. I don't think the money was necessarily going to the regimes or the governments in these corrupt countries. And I think what we have to consider is that the needs of the general populace in corrupt countries is likely to be much higher than in non-corrupt countries. There is a direct causation between a corrupt regime and starving people in need of our help. So I'd like to know exactly what the figures were before damning it or suggesting that the money has gone to the regimes. I think in countries like North Korea, we know what a desperate place that is and the starvation that exists there because of the policies of the regime there. I'd like to know what exactly the money was going to before we start judging it. I don't think it's being, as Suzanne said, going to prop up corrupt regimes. If it is, obviously that's scandalous, it shouldn't happen, but I don't know that it necessarily is. I think the 0.7% target, which has existed for some 35 years and was enshrined in the Millennium Development Goals that all the rich countries of the world committed to in order to try and halve poverty within a generation. I do agree it is an arbitrary figure, but I think the sentiment behind it, the ambition of it, is something to be commended. We do need to know that the aid money we send abroad is effectively spent, that there is aid effectiveness. That's only fair because it makes sure that it's going to people who need it most, that it's having a material difference to people's lives. But also from the point of view of those who spend the money, who pay for the money in the first place, and this is I think the UKIP line, you need to have aid transparency to make sure that the taxpayers in this country know that it's going to the right people, that it's going to help people get out of poverty so they won't need our aid in future. And I think that's commendable, and I think we should support it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. And I suspect that this might be the only question we have tonight where there is a degree of consensus, where I think that there are at least 4 politicians, not Suzanne, who are likely to agree on the fundamentals in relation to aid and overseas aid. Suzanne quoted this figure of £1 billion that's been spent. For instance, and Syria was mentioned, well, the UK government has spent something like £700 million on supporting refugees in and around Syria. And that is countries like Jordan and the Lebanon. And of course, the alternative to doing that, doing nothing, for instance, the alternative and the impact of doing nothing could very well be that a very much greater number of Syrian refugees will seek to come to the United Kingdom, something which I think most of us believe there needs to be control over. So doing nothing actually opens the UK up to a greater threat of illegal immigrants coming to this country, and that's why I think it is worth making that investment in overseas countries. And clearly, as I think Matthew said, there is a very clear correlation between corrupt countries and countries that are the poorest, and therefore it is not that surprising that the UK government is directly involved in providing aid to those countries. And just to give you a few, finally, just a few figures, because I think it's important that when UKIP talks about slashing the aid budget, because that's what they're talking about, I think we need to know, out of the things that I'm about to list, which of the things they think are not necessary. So in the last year, the UK government provided 43 million people with access to clean water, prevented 19 million children under 15 and pregnant women from going hungry, reached over 11 million people with emergency food assistance, and supported 10 million children into primary and lower secondary schools. So that is what our investment overseas is going into. If UKIP wants to slash the aid budget, which of those things are not necessary?
Perhaps I can come back on that, Chair, if I may.
I think you need Sasha to...
Or does Sasha want to talk first?
Would I make a comment?
Yes, I mean, it's not about stopping aid altogether, it's about cutting the budget, because I think we're paying too much. I mean, for instance, 0.7 in Britain, it's only 0.19% in America, and I think we'd all agree that America is a very generous country. Of course, we're not going to stop spending on clean water, on sanitation, on alleviating poverty. The Ebola crisis, that's where our money should be going, on health initiatives, on vaccinations. It's very, very important we prioritise money for this. But things like spending £1.2 million we've spent in aid on privatising utilities in Nigeria. What's the point of that? £600,000 on children's television in Kenya, or £80,000 on gender equality studies. These are things that don't matter to people in third world countries. What matters, it matters, but not in the sense that it's spent on foreign aid in a sort of arbitrary way. What matters is alleviating their day-to-day poverty, and that's what we prioritise.
I think, can I just say, I think the difficulty with what Suzanne has just said is that the things that she has just mentioned in terms of areas which she thinks should be cut do not amount to the 80% cut that UKIP is advocating. So many of the things that I've just listed, which she said were necessary, are in fact, if UKIP were to be in charge, those are exactly the sort of things that would be cut, because you can't cut 80% from the budget without cutting some of those measures.
Well, we'd also cut a huge amount from the budget by abolishing the Department for International Development in the first place, which racks up astonishing administration costs. They opened an office in India, they spent nearly £500,000 on furniture. I think that's unacceptable.
Who would do the work then? If you get rid of the department, who's going to do the work?
It would go back into the auspices of the Foreign Department, where it was before, and worked perfectly well and functioned perfectly happily.
Look at this list as well, which is compiled by Transparency International, and as it's been alluded to earlier, that the list has got some war-torn countries that have suffered from war: South Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, and so on. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of poverty in these countries as well, but there's no effective government. I should say that actually, I was surprised not to see in that top 20 list of corrupt countries Bangladesh, because back in the 90s, Bangladesh was #1 country on that list. And my parents are from Bangladesh, so I have got some interest there. Now, it's a horrible thing to live in a corrupt country, because as my cousins and
aunts and uncles have told me, when you go for a job interview in a corrupt country, the first thing you need to do is pass an envelope to the interviewer to get that job, regardless of your qualifications or skills. And that's what it's like to live in a corrupt country. So I'm not opposed to actually trying to actually make a difference in those countries. What needs to happen actually is that what we need to make sure of, and this is the Green Party policy, is that we have an independent, publicly accountable body that monitors the aid effectiveness of the aid that we send to these countries to ensure that it's working and looking after the people that need it most.
You, sir, with your hand. Yes?
I'd like to ask firstly...
I'll just pass you the mic.
Thank you. Poverty, pardon? Peter Morgan. Poverty, you say it's in corrupt countries. Question 1, what is the aid being, how is aid being used to address the bad governance in countries? Question 2, I don't think it's true that corrupt equals poor. Ghana's quite a poor country, but it's not a corrupt country. Population growth is a major problem with poverty. What are we doing to address population growth? For example, the population of Nigeria went up 6 times in 50 years. If population is going to grow at that rate, how are we going to address poverty? What are we doing to address population growth? Why is the aid budget increasing when other budgets are cut or held? What's the justification for actually increasing the aid? And none of the panelists have explained how they will get aid spent effectively. Zimbabwe, corrupt country, brutal dictator in charge, ruthless control. How can we help the people in Zimbabwe without helping Mugabe stay in power? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Who would like to make a comment? Robert?
I mean, there was quite a lot in that question. That was enough in that to keep us going all night. But I'll try and address some of the points that you referred to. There are a number of bodies and organisations in this country and indeed around the world that try and support countries where their democracy needs support. The Westminster Foundation for Democracy is one. There's the Carter Institute in America, which help with elections and go and observe elections. It's not election monitoring, it's observing elections, not interfering, and telling them and suggesting improvements that they could make. And well, Zimbabwe is one of the countries you referred to. Zimbabwe is a country that usually refuses to allow any election observers in, and it is very difficult. Britain obviously has got strong historical links with Zimbabwe, and whether we want to take responsibility for some of that, I don't know. You mentioned population growth. Well, in many countries in the world, the growth of the population has decreased. I mean, our friend, Sasha, I beg your pardon, from Bangladesh, again a country I know well, probably not as well as he does, but that used to have a population of 9 children for every woman, and now it's down to something like that, 2.3, I think. So, yeah, a lot of effort has been made on maternal health, on helping women and young girls with education and access, if they want to family planning issues. And that is the sort of thing where we can help in other countries. It's not population control, it's giving people access to the facilities that most women in this country have to make the decisions for themselves. So there are a number of things that we can do. I can't remember your point on the aid budget. The aid budget is increasing. Why is it protected? Well, I think it's for a whole variety of reasons, many of which came up in the first question. We're talking about some of the most desperate places in the world, and they do need our support. And the pressures on this country, if we didn't put money into those countries to help them develop, could be even worse.
Thank you. Matthew would like to...
Thank you very much, Tom. On the point on population growth, there's 2 points I'd like to make. One, which was actually you alluded to. Population growth rates are declining quite rapidly in the developing world. In this country, we used to have many, many children per couple, per woman. It took us actually centuries and decades to bring that number down. In the developing world, it's coming down very, very quickly indeed, because people are learning that larger families are more difficult to sustain. But there is a very fundamental reason why many families have large families, large amounts of children. It's because there are appalling infant death rates. People do not survive long enough. People see having children as a security, as an insurance against the future to provide them with sustenance when they get older. They feel they have to have more children because they're worried that many of them will not survive into adulthood. As the aid spend is effective and helps child health especially, I think people will see there is less of an incentive to have large families, and the numbers will come down even faster. And just the other point I'd make about the link between poverty and corruption, I don't think we were suggesting that poor countries are necessarily corrupt or corrupt countries are necessarily poor, but there is very likely to be a strong causal link between the two in many parts of the world.
Tom, can I just add, as a number of the panelists have said, the best way of controlling population growth is actually investing in education, and investing in education of young women so that they have alternatives. And that is where a substantial proportion of the budget is going. And indeed, maybe also on gender equality initiatives that Suzanne didn't feel was a good investment of our government's budget. Why was the budget protected? The budget was protected because the coalition government agreed that we would protect the budget, that we would secure 0.7% for international development, just as we agreed that we would protect the NHS budget and the budget for schools. That was a political decision, but I think it was the right thing to do. As Matthew said, the commitment that the UK government made to United Nations to deliver 0.7% GNI more than 30 years ago is one that we have finally delivered. It's my only regret that the UK is one of in fact, the only G7 country that has delivered on that pledge.
Good point as well. I think the conversation's kind of like angling towards the idea that actually it's not a good idea to kind of make any effort to support these countries that need our help because of all the potential drawbacks, whether the money's going to get to the right people and so on. But these countries, Christian Aid have done a report recently where actually these multinational companies that are mining in these poor countries, that are going for industrialized food and those sort of activities, they're actually not paying tax in those countries to the tune of £105 billion. So what needs to happen actually is that let's go after that money as well and support poorer countries to be able to get that money back from taxation and stop this tax dodging.
Thank you very much indeed, Sasha. I'd like to move on, if I may. Is Trevor Davis in the audience? Yes. Thank you very much, Trevor. You asked three very good questions, and I'll start with the first, if I may. This is your statement. The EU is a racket that looks after its own. A true statement by Nigel Farage, especially in the context of the question, does charity begin at home? There is talk about the UK taxpayers paying towards EU pensions. Would one of the panelists like to make a comment, please?
Well, shall I start?
Please do,
And then Matthew, when I'm sure he's written many speeches for the CBI on the positive aspects of the EU. I'm sure he'll want to come in behind me. I disagree with you. The EU is not a racket. What the EU has provided, it has flaws. I accept that, and those need to be addressed. I think, for instance, the rigmarole of the Parliament meeting in two places is an outrage and needs to be stopped immediately. I think some of the issues around transparency, if you think members of Parliament have issues around transparency to do with their expenses, I think in the European Union, European Parliament, I think there are significant, even greater issues that need to be addressed. But fundamentally, what the EU is about ensuring that a UK company can produce something here and know that that product can be exported to any other EU country without tariffs applying. And what that provides for us as consumers, I think, is a better deal in terms of the products that we can buy, the products that we can purchase. It provides certainty to manufacturers here that when they produce a product that they will be able to get it into a different market. And of course, manufacturers here are the people who provide many jobs. So yes, as I said, I think there are aspects of the EU that we do need to address. I think that the EU needs to tighten its belt in the way that the UK government has had to tighten its belt. I was astounded that the EU was putting in a request for a large budget increase at the same time as the UK government was by necessity having to reduce our budget here. So, but I think the business aspect of it is something that is very positive.
Thank you very much. Robert?
I'll say a few words. Yeah, but I'll put my cards on the table. I think in a few years' time, having been a member of the European Parliament for 15 years, I will be in receipt of some sort of pension from the European Parliament, in the same way that anybody who works for any company would be. And I spent 15 years as a teacher as well, so I think I'll be in. Like, as anybody, I contributed to a teacher's pension, I contributed to a European Parliament pension, which I'll get in a few years, hopefully a few more years time. So yes, but some of the pensions, I agree, some of the packages for high EU officials seem to be enormous, and I'm afraid that is not unique to the European Union. There's a lot of a scandal over the huge pension payoffs to people at the BBC and other companies in this country, and people on enormous amounts which are very difficult to justify. The European Union, as we now have it, was started in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War to prevent war in Europe. And on that count, it's been singularly successful. Well, NATO, you mentioned NATO. NATO is a military union, and military power can bring peace. What it cannot do is keep peace, and you need democratic structures. You need democratic structures to keep peace. The British Army brought some sort of peace in Northern Ireland, but the only lasting peace has become because there's democratic structures and people recognise that. European Union. I'm sorry? In where?
In the knee in Northern Ireland.
I can't hear what he said. I
think he's saying people are still shooting people in Northern Ireland.
Oh, well, the number of people being killed in Northern Ireland is a fraction of what it was before, and I think we should welcome the peace process there. The peace in Western Europe, brought about by the European Union, is immensely successful, and there may not be many people here, and I'm not one, who went through the generation that lived through war, and those people will welcome the fact there's now 28 countries in the European Union working closely together. Yes, there are all sorts of things that have to be done. Tom referred to the budget increase. Well, European Union, 28 countries. We know that there are some of the countries in the European Union that are poorer and need support. And I don't have any qualms about saying it's right that we should support the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, because many of them are emerging democracies that do need our support. And if we don't do that, if you see, people I have, with great respect, then you want to look at the reasons why people come to this country from Poland, from Czech Republic, from those countries. They will come here because they can earn there's no evidence to suggest that people leave those countries and come here just for the benefits. They come here with the intention of working, and the vast majority of them, a higher proportion of people from Central and Eastern Europe in this country, if you let me finish, instead of just trying to abuse it, if you did listen to the answer, you might find it a little bit more informative. You may not agree with me, but at least might listen. The vast majority of people who uproot their family and themselves and travel hundreds of miles to another country where they perhaps are not as brilliantly averse with the language as they'd like to be, do so because they want to work. If we are serious, If we are serious about supporting those people, and if you have concerns about the number of people who come to this country from other countries in the European Union, then you should be supporting giving more money to those countries to help them so that their economies can recover, their countries can be more prosperous, and people can stay there, and they can live in their own communities there. You cannot have it both ways if you have people in this country who still want to go and live in Spain, in France, and you want to travel around the world as well. So you really need to understand the whole complex situation.
If you would kindly let the panellist have his word, and he'll be very pleased to answer a question.
I've just done that. You may not like it, but I've just done it.
I'll try and keep my comments brief and to the original statement that was made. I agree with Tom, absolutely. There are many positive aspects to the European Union in terms of when we work together on things, on consumer protection as an excellent example, on crime and security, and actually overseas aid, international aid is another area where collectively we can do far more than we could do individually. I think it's sad that other European Union countries haven't matched our efforts in terms of proportion of gross national income. There we go. But as for the overall comment as to whether or not it's a racket, I think the idea behind the EU, free movement of goods, capital, people and so forth is excellent. I think a lot of the ideals behind it are excellent. I think the way it's administered now is, I think a racket is a perfectly reasonable way to describe it. I think there is a terrible democratic deficit. I think its accounts haven't been signed off for, Suzanne will know this, 20 years or so?
Yep.
Yeah, something like that. So I think it's got problems. I think we need to reform it, and then we need to put the reformed EU to a referendum to the British people. And if we want to get out, well, we'll get out.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, I have contributed, so I won't contribute again, but I would like to ask Matthew whether when he wrote speeches for the CBI about the EU, whether he ever called the EU a racket.
Well, it wasn't me making the speeches, so I'm sure I would never have put that word in the Director General's.
No, I'm sure.
But it might have been there in the subtext. And actually, I did write speeches about the European Union, and I criticised Michel Barnier, who was the Commissioner for Financial Services. And I said that some of his worst ideas were created by Laboratoire Barnier, and they were particularly damaging to one of this country's really great industries, which is financial services. So I wasn't against criticising them, or indeed putting the words in someone else's mouth, but I was normally skulking in the background somewhere. So had it been me, racket is a word I might well have used.
Suzanne, would you like to make a comment?
Well, I'm not going to disagree with Nigel Farage, am I? That could get me into terrible trouble. Yeah, of course it's a racket. It's an absolute racket. Over the next course of the European Parliament, we're going to be spending some 67 billion net, I think. Actually, not the next Parliament, I think between now and 2020. I can't remember the exact figure, but it's a massive amount of money that we pay to the EU. £55 million every day. Yes, we get some of that back in terms of our rebate, but by anyone's calculations, even the most optimistic calculations, we get far less than half back. And the money really is squandered, and that to me is what a racket is. I don't know so much about pensions, I'll be honest, but I do know that the EU spent £400,000 on a fitness centre for dogs in Hungary that was, as far as we're aware, has never been built yet. It paid off debts that were incurred, private debts that were incurred by the King of Sweden, so he looked better. I don't know, perhaps Robert will know more about this than me, but I gather that Neil and Glenys Kinnock, between the two of them, when they were both working for the European Union, ended up earning some £10 million out of it by one estimate that I've seen. I mean, it's absolutely scandalous, the amount of money. And frankly, Robert, I know that it was supposed to be set up as this great political project to have peace in Europe after 2 world wars, and I'm sure at the time that was considered to be a very noble objective. But has it led to peace? No. Look at what's happening in the Ukraine. Now,
not in the European
Union.
Union.
Exactly, but they want it to be in the European Union, and that's the problem. And there's no doubt that money was spent by the European Union to oppose Russia there. The civil unrests that we've seen on the streets across Europe as a result of the collapse of the euro, I don't call that peace.
Euro hasn't collapsed. I don't know if you've noticed.
It's collapsed in Greece, it's collapsed in Portugal, Greece is on the way out.
But
Ireland,
people, not long
it's been an
ago,
absolute
people from
disaster.
UKIP, Nigel Farage and others were saying that Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal were going to be pushed out of the euro, but they weren't.
They haven't been yet.
very easy to quote the countries where there are problems, and of course there are problems in Greece, Italy, Spain, but you haven't quoted the countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and the other countries in the north where the euro is very successfully working. Had Britain been in the euro, which group would we have been? Might have been in the more successful one. Well, you know, the economies of some of these countries, the Netherlands is doing very well, thank you. Luxembourg.
Chair.
I think you've also highlighted the problem there, that again... there's
If you'd have a
another issue.
question, madam, I'll give you a microphone so we can all hear.
There's another issue, isn't there, about when we joined the European Union, we had some influence. It was a group of nations that were of a similar economic base. As the European Union has expanded,
can I just
we've
say,
got a lot less influence, and it's caused a lot more economic problems for us.
Find the EU's such a scandal and it's a racket, why do you draw your salary from the European Union?
I don't.
The MEPs, why do they draw the salary?
Well, why shouldn't they? They do a job just like any other MEP in the Parliament.
It's almost endorsing it in a way. If you want to show principle,
What are you
don't
suggesting?
accept
They work
the
for
salary.
free? They work for free, they travel to Strasbourg, they travel to
Don't have
Brussels
to,
for
not-
free?
don't have
worst
to draw the
attenders of
salary.
committees.
Actually,
Show
that's not
principle
true.
and don't draw the salary. Can I carry on?
Look, can I just remind you that UKIP won the European elections? What are our MEPs supposed to do? Having been elected, sit at home and do nothing? And not go and not
Well,
draw a
when you turn
salary?
up to the European Union,
you can't.
When you're
you
elected
do
an
nothing
MP,
anyway.
when you're
Thank you
elected
very
an
much
MP,
indeed.
will
I
you be
think-
prepared
Can
not
I just
to draw
say,
a
can I-
salary?
I think we could spend the evening debating this, so I need to move
Can I just say
on.
one thing on the EU? Just one thing very quickly. There's a very important thing that's happening about the European Union and the US, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Partnership. TTIP as it's known. And I don't know how many of you know about it, but basically it means that the rules and regulations will change for corporations. So they'll actually have their own judicial system, that this is what is secretly being discussed. So when a corporation actually, let's say for example in Australia at the moment, Philip Morris, the tobacconist, is actually looking to sue the Australian government for actually removing packaging on cigarette packets. They'll threaten to do that in this country as well through TTIP. Now, in other countries in South America, where they tried to introduce a minimum wage, corporations have gone after them to be able to actually sue them as well for losses. Now, this is the discussion that's happening with the Lib Dems, Labour and the Conservative all in favour. Now, if you kind of approve this sort of behaviour and you want us to be able to actually be sued by a corporation that's going to be taking on our NHS services in the future, let's say for example, then you've got a choice actually. You can vote for one of those three parties, or you go for the Green Party, which opposes TTIP.
As does UKIP.
Well, because it's a European Union issue, I guess.
Thank you very much indeed for your views, Sasha. Sorry, Trevor, I can't hear your question.
He's thanking us. You're very welcome. It's probably a stick potato.
All right. Yeah, I just want to thank the panel for their answers, but I still you haven't changed my mind. I still believe that the EU is a racket, and I support fully what Suzanne has said, because I believe that the more we hear of what is coming out of the EU, ridiculous projects and wasteful bureaucracy, certainly I would stand by what my statement is. Thank you.
The EU is only as good as the member states and the people. The EU is the European Parliament, the European Commission and the Council of Ministers of the governments. It doesn't have a sort of driver of its own. It is only as good as the people who are putting into it. So if you think it's a racket, well then you've got to condemn all of those factions, and you've got to condemn the successive government ministers from this country and from all the other countries. So, you know, we are part of it, so it's not a completely separate body. We're part of it, the UKIP members of the European Parliament, everybody involved in it, and it's up to all of us, if you think it's not functioning properly, to make it better.
Well, let's have a referendum then. Let's have a vote. And that's the problem, isn't it? We can't vote any of those unelected commissioners out. We're stuck with them.
Which ones do you want to...
Thank you very much indeed. I now like to move on. Is Leanne Bruni in the audience? Thank you, Leanne. Leanne's question is, 1 in 4 children in the UK live in poverty. bearing this in mind, shouldn't our priority be eliminating poverty in the UK as opposed to abroad? Thank you for your question, Leanne. Matthew?
Straight away, that's a figure of relative poverty. You cannot eliminate relative poverty. It's not possible. It's not absolute poverty they live in. So that's the problem with that figure. It's a very simple answer, but you can't eliminate relative poverty.
So if you can't eliminate relative poverty, then why are we trying to eliminate poverty around the world? Because that's relative to.
That's absolute poverty.
Well, absolute poverty is the point. I mean, those on less than $1 a day or $1.10, whatever it is now. Yes. Yeah, but the point is, if you set a thing that says you are in poverty if your income is at 60% of the national average, which is how relative poverty is assigned, you're always going to have people who are in relative poverty. It's always going to happen. Yes. Well, the debate over this doesn't. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Leanne. Tom?
Clearly, the governments, the coalition governments, have put in place a number of measures to deal with poverty in the UK amongst children, and that is why, for instance, we have invested very heavily in free school meals. So, for instance, reception year 1, year 2 pupils will get free school meals. That helps to address poverty in terms of, for parents, it's worth about £400 a year to a parent. We've provided free nursery education for 3 and 4-year-olds. We're now providing free nursery education for 40% of 2-year-olds. So there are measures that the UK government are taking to try and address poverty, particularly poverty amongst children. But I think, as Matthew said, the issue about relative poverty is that you could have a situation where people were living comfortably at home, but 60% of the population had a much larger disposable income, and you would find people in relative poverty. So I think and I don't think you can make a comparison with what is happening in developing countries and say, well, it's relative to them. If they're living off $1 a day, that's fine because $1 a day in their country is an adequate level of standard of living. In practice, as I quoted almost at the beginning, the UK government is funding 19 million children under 5 and pregnant women from going hungry. So it's not about relative poverty in developing countries, it's actually about funding them so that they don't starve.
Leanne, we need to pass you the mic because we're recording this and we can't hear it unless you have a microphone.
So I just wanted to say there are people starving in this country, hence the rise of food banks. So, and also I want to say, when you're talking about relative poverty, there's a strong rich-poor divide. So what are you doing about that? Because there's people living in, it is relative, but it's still not fair. That, for example, it was in the news that, you know, they called it Fat Cat Friday or something, where the richest people had earned most of what we had earned in just a few weeks. You know, they'd earned, you know, the average salary of, you know, 30,000 or something in just a few days. And that's what some people in Britain earn for the whole year. So I think we've got to look at this disparity. You know, there's a real disparity, and we shouldn't just dismiss it by saying, oh, it's relative. Because, you know, let's be honest, you all on the panel are not living in that relative poverty.
Well, can I just point out that under the present government, inequality has actually reduced. I agree with you, however, that it is something that any government needs to continue to address, because it's very clear that the countries where the level of inequality is the smallest tend to be the countries that are actually the healthiest, if I can put it that way, typically the Scandinavian countries.
I think you can also make another comparison, if you may. I mean, look at the banner for water aid. Even people who are going to food banks and in the most desperate situation in this country have access to clean water. There are millions of children, possibly even 1 billion children and families in the world who don't have access to clean water. So I'm not going to use the term relative poverty, but I'm sure you see, if you haven't been there, you've seen pictures of countries where people are starving. There are people who are going short of food and hungry in this country, and it's a tragedy, and it shouldn't be happening. But in other countries, there are whole swathes of people. We know this. You've seen it on the television, of people who are millions of people starving, children dying of starvation, haven't had a meal for days. This country, we have a social service that supports families and supports people. And yes, sometimes they do slip through the loop, and yes, we've got to do more, and this government is trying to do so. But if you've been to places in the world where you see, I went to Sri Lanka after the tsunami and the situation there, you wouldn't say we shouldn't be doing everything to support them. And people in this country, when there are appeals, are very, very generous. The DEC, the Disaster Emergencies Committee, supports people in appalling situations around the world. So I don't think the two are separate. Yes, we've got to address poverty in this country, but we've also got to have a budget to support some of the most desperate situations all around the world. And I think it would be a dreadful shame if any political party was saying we shouldn't be supporting children and families starving in some of the poorest parts of the world.
To substantiate your figures there, Robert, 1 million children go to bed every night hungry. 900 billion people go to bed without clean water in the following morning. And 2.4 billion people don't have a toilet. So this is what we're comparing ourselves with. Those poor people that don't have water and don't have sanitation. Thank you, Robert. Suzanne?
Thank you. Well, let's go back to Leanne's question. It was, a quarter of children in the United Kingdom live in poverty. Should we be spending money abroad? Well, Leanne, I really don't think it's an either-or situation. I think we have responsibilities at home, but I do think we have responsibilities abroad as well. At home, at least we know where the money's going at home, so I think we should not hold back from looking to see what we can do in a very direct way to alleviate poverty. One of the ways in which UKIP wants to do this, first of all, is to make sure that all those families that are living on minimum wage are taken out of tax altogether. I think it's disgraceful that you can be working full-time, every day, full-time job, just getting paid a minimum wage, and then you get a tax bill as well. I think that's an insult. If we have decided that the minimum wage is the least amount that we need to live on, why the heck should we pay tax on it? So we would definitely want to see that personal allowance threshold raised. At the moment, that would be about £13,500, and I'm sure my Liberal Democrat, Tom, would agree with that sort of aspiration as well.
I think there's a consensus on the panel almost. I'm not sure what the Labour Party position is, but so
quite
we're all in
possibly.
agreement.
That's something that's very easy that we could do to help lift children out of poverty straight away. One of the other things, and so many people now in this country too are living in fuel poverty, and that does affect children. If you're a child, how do you do your homework if you're cold? How do you sleep at night if you're cold? And we've got to look at getting fuel bills down. Now, at least £93 at the moment of every fuel bill that every family in this country gets is because of green levies, which go into things like wind farms and solar arrays, which are actually pretty inefficient forms of energy. So we would want to get rid of those as well. They're set to rise to nearly £200 per family by 2020. And that again is a very simple way that we could remove those levies and cut fuel bills. It's about the cost of living. And ultimately what UKIP is about, and I'm proud of this, is about getting more money to keep more people to get more of their money kept in their pocket. I think there is an issue too about children going hungry, and I think it's appalling that teachers, my sister's a teacher, she sees kids turning up hungry, going home hungry. We've got to sort out this problem, and I think one of the ways we could do that is giving wraparound childcare. So we have breakfast clubs, we have after school and homework clubs where children are fed as well, and that would be really something that would really benefit kids in this country, I think.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Yeah, again, like it's been alluded as well, I'm very uncomfortable with the question that you compare one poor child, for example, a child that's in a poor country in Africa or Asia who has to walk maybe 8 miles every day to just get drinking water, compared with maybe a child whose mother is just lost her incapacity benefit because they just failed the fit for work test by Atos or something along those lines. and they're struggling as well. So what needs to happen is that we need to support both groups. Now, as a Green, when I hear statistics like 85 people on this planet have the same amount of wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion people on this planet, it disgusts me. And when I hear Boris Johnson talk about the amount of, and bragging about the amount of billionaires that live in London, and that are more than New York and Paris, it's quite abhorrent to hear that sort of thing. So we want to see inequality reduced in the Green Party. Now, one of the things we would do, policies we would do at home, well, one thing we would do is actually not have the austerity measures that all but 22 MPs yesterday voted for £30 billion worth of austerity measures, which is going to affect the poorest in our society and the most vulnerable. And again, the Green Party MP Caroline Lucas is one of those MPs, because it's not in her principle to do that, voted against it. Now, overseas, what we should be doing is actually looking at a Robin Hood tax, a tax on financial transactions. Now, I'm not talking about a 5% tax on transactions. I'm not talking a 0.5% tax on transactions. It's just 0.05% tax on financial transactions, and that will raise £250 billion. Foreign exchange markets were those big bankers that are exchanging the money. Are you opposed to that then? Why? How so? Can they not afford it?
If you tax financial transactions, like stamp duty on house purchase, it comes back and hits the ordinary people. If you tax the wealthy, then the ordinary people pay more. Look at the football players. Look at in France, they put the tax rate up to 75%, but footballers in France are on net pay deals. So they get the same money, but the club has to pay the extra tax, and the club goes bust. The punters have to pay the tax.
It's not relevant,
If you complain about...
It's not relevant.
You asked me the question,
I'll tell you about... Listen,
if you tax financial transactions, there is a massive burden of administration, and that money has to come from the transaction.
Is that because...
So when you buy your...
What's Douglas Carswell's former
job?
Me. Oh, he's a banker, that was right.
I'm not concerned with that person. If you want to go abroad, you have to buy a foreign currency. If you have to pay another tax on it, your currency costs more.
Well, you make sure that you put legislation in to stop that from happening.
How?
Listen, if you have principle, you'll stop it. Because I am interested in stopping inequality, unlike maybe the UKIP party.
Thank you very much.
There's a lady
Oh, okay. It's just one thing that's bothering me about all this poverty and everything, is that a lot of rich people, and especially rich foreign investors, are just buying up all our properties in England and just raking off money from there. And that means that people who live here actually can't afford to buy their own homes and can't afford to live. And that is increasing the poverty of this country. And what good is that doing to ordinary people?
I was shocked, actually. I recently heard the Deputy Mayor of London talking in Wimbledon, where I live, talking about how wonderful it was that part of London, Queensway, I think it was, or Bayswater, was now practically owned entirely by an Arab state, and he thought this was wonderful, and he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could sell all of Wimbledon Broadway to India or China? And I was just completely aghast at the very idea of it. There are lots of countries now buying up apartment blocks as investment properties, and what's happening is the people who are renting those are ending up on the streets. And when I was a councillor in the London Borough of Merton, the #1 cause of homelessness was the ending of private tenancies. And I'm absolutely with you. I'm convinced that part of the problem is because we've got foreign investors buying up. They don't have the emotional and social investment in the country, and you know, the social services in this country are ending up having to pick up the pieces. It's wrong.
Tom.
Is anything at all being done to stop this happening? Because it's really upsetting. I mean, it started off with people buying places in Cornwall, rich people buying places, and then local people can't afford to buy. I personally think it ought to be illegal for foreigners to buy places here until they've lived here for at least 10 years. And I think that people shouldn't be able to just buy second homes and just rent them out. I don't believe in property for investment because it's making people homeless. It's just not fair.
Thank you for your question. Tom?
Well, first of all, what can we do about it? And here I think there's a different coalition around the issue of the £2 million sort of mansion tax, as it's been dubbed, as in people who, with properties that are worth £2 million or more, having to make a more substantial contribution. And I think this is where there is a difference of opinion between the two coalition partners in terms of how do we finish addressing the budget deficit. And I think the Conservative Party wants to do that by, I think, making further cuts. We think that, yes, unfortunately, there is a need to reduce budgets, and that's why Sasha is right. A couple of days ago, there was an agreement, a cross-party agreement, certainly the main parties, that there is a need to reduce budgets by £30 billion to ensure that we get rid of the deficit. But one of the ways that we would do that as a party, and I think the Labour Party have indicated as well, is by generating some more revenue by ensuring that people who are property owners of properties that are worth £2 million or more, in other words, very wealthy people, are making a greater contribution financially than is currently the case. The other side, I think, of your question is, of course, we are suffering from a major housing shortage in London. So yes, there is on the one hand foreigners buying up some of the most expensive properties, but realistically the demand is for properties that are not the £10 million properties, it's for affordable homes. And that's why certainly we have plans which would see something like 270,000 new affordable homes built in London. How would that be done? That would be done, for instance, by using the land that the mayor has more effectively, whether it's Transport for London, the GLA, the land that they have that could be brought into use, and various other measures to boost the availability of housing, because that is the fundamental problem, the problem that I see in my surgery every week. It's young people, it's families who cannot afford to buy any properties, and that is partly because there is a shortage of supply.
We can't hear the question.
As well, and I'm going to buy that flat, and I'm going to buy that flat, and so other people can't get them because the price goes up so much. How are you going to stop that? How? Well,
could I say a couple of things? We've heard tonight some sort of acerbic comments about people from abroad coming here because they're on a scrounge. And now we're hearing comments about people who are coming here from abroad who are too rich and keep wanting to buy everything. I think it is wonderful that wealthy, successful people come to London, that they are wealth creators, that we have a very thriving financial services industry in London. I think it is unfortunate that it is perceived that the very small amounts of properties they buy in very expensive areas is a huge problem. The issue, in fact, is, as Tom rightly said, is a lack of supply at the other end of normal family homes and all the rest of it. The government, the coalition government, has in fact done something about this, in that stamp duty rates have gone up markedly on the most expensive properties. That means that those people who have the money to buy expensive properties pay far more in tax. Where I differ from the Liberal Democrats and Labour is I don't believe that those people who live in properties which happen to have become very valuable should pay large amounts of tax every year just because they happen to live in those properties. I think it's those who can afford to buy them, that's where it should come in, the stamp duty. But I think the other thing we have to remember is that an awful lot of British people own second properties abroad. And I think we have to be careful about saying that foreigners can't come here because we want to go there as well. So this is what happens in an open market, it's what happens in a free society. I think there are a lot of good points to it, not just the few bad.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. I'm sorry, I must move on now to the final question, and after that question we'll take a vote. The question is from Raj Sood, and the question is, when will the government and the Labour Party listen to its 70 million citizens. Can the traditional parties not understand that we are simply fed up with, we're simply fed up with foreign aid policy and the cuts that affect us here? When will you hear us? After the next coalition of UKIP and the Greens? Suzanne?
A UKIP coalition with the Greens? I don't think that's very likely somehow, not least because I think UKIP's position is that we don't really want to go into coalition with anyone in the next Parliament. We would very much like to hold the...
I don't think anyone would want you, would they? So.
Well, I think the Tories might have us, and I think you might have us if you were pushed as well, and it was the only option you got. But I don't think we will, because we might consider what's called a confidence and supply arrangement, so you could have a government, be able to form a government and to get certain key bills through and the budget through and things like that, and then we would vote on our conscience according to the rest. But I think we've seen actually with the current coalition that coalitions probably aren't very good for either party. I certainly sense on the doorstep when I'm out campaigning that people are fed up with traditional parties. Yes, I think people see them as being all the same, and I think in many parts that is very much true. Fewer and fewer members of Parliament now have had real jobs. Many have been researchers for members of Parliament before becoming MPs themselves. They often go into politics straight out of school. And I think people in UKIP buck the trend. The people that I meet in UKIP who are standing for Parliament are very much like me. They're people that went into politics later in life, that had had a huge amount of life experience under their belt, both in terms of education, in terms of actually being in a workplace. I've run my own businesses. I've helped set up several other businesses. I've set up a charity. And I think what the people of Britain want is some common sense. They get fed up with spin. Get fed up with political infighting, the Punch and Judy politics, and I think we are offering the public something very different, and I think that's why they're voting for us.
Oh, I didn't have anything particularly to add, actually, to that. I just thought it's ironic that someone accuses other politicians of playing Punch and Judy politics. I mean, the sense of irony obviously lost in you, but there we go. I do think if we're going to talk about party politics, I'd hope we wouldn't. Actually, I'd hope we'd talk a little bit more tonight about international aid, but if we're going to talk about party politics, I must say I find UKIP to be a populist mob, really, all the time. They have very easy answers to very complicated, intractable problems. And I think people should be wary of that and look very carefully at the fine print, if there is any, and think very carefully about what is in their own long-term best interests. So I think, it's lovely that Nigel Farage can come out and come up with a few bon mots and have a few pints and the rest of it. But, this is more serious than that, frankly.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Robert?
The question that was just asked actually said the population of this country is 70 million, it's actually 64, but that's neither here nor there. But the question wasn't just about whether people are fed up with traditional political parties, and there's no doubt that the evidence is that the parties that were traditional parties are getting a smaller percentage of the vote. But the question was that they are fed up with it and fed up with the foreign aid policies of those parties. Now, I don't believe that if you were to have a referendum on foreign aid, international development budget in this country, that you would have a majority of people in this country who would want to stop aid going to some of the poorest places of the world, which we've discussed tonight. I really believe that the 70 million people, or 64 million, or however many vote, the vast majority of those are decent, sensible people who would understand the rationale for having a budget to help the countries in the world, whether it's with water aid or countries where people are starving. And I think there would be a wide swathe body of support amongst the four of the political parties here, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, and other parties. I'm afraid it's only UKIP at the moment that is saying they want to cut the international development budget, and I think if there were a referendum on that, I think the vast majority of people in this country would support, not without reforms, but would support the principle of continuing it.
Thank you, Robert.
Of interest repayments that we are having to make as a result of our debt, which of course is generated because we have a deficit, the amount that we spend on interest is greater than the total that is spent on law and order, Ministry of Justice and Transport put together, for instance. So if we don't deal with those economic problems, then actually all we end up doing is paying interest on the debt that we're incurring. So good luck to UKIP if they think by putting forward two policies, one's come out of the EU and two to stop immigration, if they think that is the solution to the deficit, well, they can say that if they want, but let's make sure that the facts that they are deploying are correct. The great thing about technology is that you can instantly check some of the things that were said. So this figure of 55 million that Suzanne talks about, well, actually, if we want to be accurate, it's 33 million, so that's inflated by 80%. The figure that she referred to in terms of how much on each energy bill do the environmental measures cost us, which is incidentally a figure that was provided by an energy company. She said £93. I think the IPPR, which I accept is a left-wing think tank and therefore may not be entirely independent, suggests actually the cost is £15. So it's important that when we have these arguments that actually we do it on the basis of fact rather than fantasy, because otherwise there's no point in having the discussion.
Well, my figures came from Ed Davey, actually. Yep.
Very much indeed. And the final word from Sasha.
Thank you. So if foreign aid and international aid matters to you, obviously there's certain sections of the room it doesn't, but if it does, you should maybe go back to 2010, just before the election, when all the manifestos were out. The World Development Movement analysed the policies of all the parties, and they marked them out of 10. So the Green Party was scored top, 8 out of 10. Lib Dems, 6 out of 10, Labour, 5 out of 10, and the Conservatives, 3 out of 10. So if it matters to you about international aid, foreign aid, and supporting poorer countries, then the Green Party is the party for you. Now, I do sense as well that people are fed up with politics and political parties. I have to confess, I don't really consider myself a politician as such. I feel I'm more of a campaigner. One of the things I'm doing is actually, as was mentioned at the start, I'm taking Sutton Council to court about building an incinerator just about 3.5 miles away from here. At quite great risk to myself, actually. At one point, there was a risk I could possibly lose my house, about the monies that I'd have to find to be able to tackle, actually, not just Sutton Council, Croydon Council, Suzanne's Council, Merton, and also Kingston Council, and also a FTSE 250 company called Viridor. So therefore, if you're looking for somebody who cares about the community they live in, I do live in this community in Croydon North, in Thornton Heath area, in Selhurst, then you should maybe look for a candidate that's going to represent you from the heart and through principle. Now, one of the strangest things that's happening actually at the moment is just last night, about 11 o'clock on my phone, I looked at a Twitter account, and actually last night, 1,900 new members just joined the Green Party. 1,900. And we've just, I believe, just overtaken UKIP in their membership nationally now, and with a fraction of the publicity that UKIP are having. Now, what is happening is that people are actually looking deeply at this, especially younger people, because they maybe actually haven't grasped onto a political party and haven't grasped onto a brand, and is actually looking for answers. And actually, amongst 18 to 24-year-olds now, the Green Party's tied with the Conservatives in second place on 22%. Now, if you go to a website called Vote for Policies, where people go in and choose any of the subjects on any of the issues, could be education, health, the environment, or policing, or what have you, you get some questions, and you put in your answers that you like, or you see the answers ahead of you, if you like, and you don't get to see which party is actually putting that for you. The Vote for Policies website is encouraging people to look at policies and not personalities. Now, if you go to that website, Vote for Policies website, the Croydon North constituency, which is a very strong, safe Labour seat, the winning party at the moment is the Green Party. Does that surprise anybody? Well, if you actually look at the policies carefully that you think you believe in, those other parties that you think are representing you don't actually do that. It's the Green Party that's representing your views.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could spend another 2 hours quite easily, but sadly time won't permit it. I'd like to ask the audience their views. There's been a great deal of time spent about overseas aid. I'd like you to raise your hand if you feel that we should continue with the same level of overseas aid. Please raise your hand if you think we should. Oh, that's good. It's about 60–70%. Thank you very much indeed for attending. Thank you, panelists, for your excellent answers. And thank you very much for your questions. Good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, just before you leave, our panel, I'd like to thank you all for coming, certainly particularly those who came at the last minute, thank you. We are obviously a charity, so I'm going to ask you if you could make another small donation on your way out. And I'm going to ask the panel if they will kindly go to the rear of the room where you came in, and if you'd like to ask them a quick question, I mean quick, or shake their hand, have your photograph taken with our official photographer, we'd be happy to arrange that. Thank you very much. So if the panel could please go to the rear.